great to have you guys here. So what we're going to do is this is, a little bit different format than we usually do with our podcast. Usually this is more of a one-on-one thing. So we decided, since this is kind of a big deal, looking at all the emerging technologies that's going to supposedly change our lives over the next 10 years, we should probably get some experts that represent a variety of different aspects of the technology world. And so today I've got 3 rock stars that are focused on specific aspects of the technology world. And to add a little bit of a twist to things, it's also technologists with bourbon. So it's going to be fun and interesting. So with that, what we're going to do is we're just going to do a quick round of intros, and we're going to talk about one, provide your name, your role within the organization, and what sort of emerging tech stuff are you up to? Just a brief 1 or 2 minutes, and then the bourbon that you chose to drink tonight, or would drink tonight if you didn't have calls following this, and why you picked that specific bourbon. And so, Arun, I'm going to start with you and have you kick us off here.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks again for having me over. This is so fun. So my name is Arun Ghosh. I am a partner at KPMG. I lead our blockchain efforts across our audit, tax, and advisory business. In this role for about 2 years, mostly because it's a lot of fun, doing lots of different things, and working very closely with Microsoft and Mike. So and very enjoyable experience in terms of what we do, but also looking ahead, and that's some of the things that I guess we'll talk about tonight. The bourbon that I really like drinking, I would have drunk if I didn't have a call subsequently, is Buffalo Trace. Actually, it's become
excellent choice.
Right, it's become very popular, but past its own hype cycle. Right. Right. See what I did there, Mike? Hey, yeah. This is what happens when you get me on a session. So past its own hype cycle, it grows on you. Right? It's a good drink to come home, a long day, or on a weekend, you're sitting by with friends and family. You want to just open a nice, smooth bourbon and let it sit, right? And it goes with a lot of palates, right? You don't need to have it as an after drink or a after dinner or pre-dinner aperitif kind of situation. It goes along the food continuum, if I can say that. So I like it that way. That's what I'm drinking right now, and very glad to be here.
That's awesome. And yeah, Buffalo Trace definitely is, it's a staple. You probably see it in the background there here in my home pub. The bourbon that I have that I'm not sharing with you right now, that's a similar thing as yours is, Woodford Reserve is one, is another one of my go-tos that I'll always have stocked, and it's kind of the go-to. But let's move over to Todd. Todd, tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me. And actually, you had me at bourbon. I'm happy to be here. I am the managing director of North Coast Ventures. North Coast includes 6 different venture funds and angel funds with over 250 individual investors. We've invested in 59 companies over the last 10 years. Most of these companies tend to be business-to-business software as a service. They can be in spaces like healthcare IT, digital health, MarTech, InsurTech, HR tech. B2B SaaS shows up in a lot of places. We tend to look for companies that solve big problems, for companies that know they have a problem, that have someone whose job it is to solve that problem, and ideally a budget to address it. We try to avoid the nice to haves that way.
So what you're saying, Todd, is they've passed step 1 of the questions.
Indeed. And so the conversations we have tend to be more oriented around a business problem that they're experiencing versus a particular technology. And personally, I work with startups at every stage of the pipeline and with portfolio companies to help them be successful. The bourbon that I chose is Kentucky bourbon, Angel's Envy.
Nice.
Angel's Envy, of course, has all the good marketing materials of hand-blended batches and 6 to 12 barrels at a time, finished in port barrels, actually. I like the straight bourbon, but I normally would have the rye, but mine seems to have disappeared tonight, so I'm left with this. And as I mentioned, we have investors and angel investors. So angel investors, Angel's Envy, it kind of becomes our drink We've yet to become sponsored by Angels Envy, much to my dismay, but I'm going to keep plugging them in the hopes that they come through for us at some point.
Nice. Mike, give us an intro of who you are and the bourbon that you chose.
Great. Hi, all. My name is Mike Fulton. I am in technology, strategy, and innovation at Nationwide. Our job is to research and understand new and emerging technologies and then help drive adoption and scale of the most important technologies that matter across the organization. In addition to that, I am also an adjunct faculty member at The Ohio State University right here in Columbus, Ohio, and am in the process of standing up a digital executive education program with Ohio State that Mike is helping me out with and is soon to be a fellow faculty member of, hopefully, if all goes as planned. So we're looking forward to that. A little scary, but it's been a fun journey. My bourbon tonight is actually in honor of both Mike and Ohio State. As you can see on the little tag on it here, it is made in Ohio, which is kind of actually a problem because it's called an Ohio State bourbon whiskey. And if I understand my bourbon history, you actually have to be brewed in Kentucky to be a bourbon, if I'm correct.
So Mike, I thought the same thing.
All right, did I get it wrong?
We both got it wrong. So
okay.
I was years, I said, it's not bourbon unless it came from Kentucky. I actually looked at the law that was passed in the 60s because this is an actual law that was passed. Bourbon is the only native spirit of America. We don't have anything else. That's all we got. Right. But the law says it has to be brewed in or distilled in the U.S. So it can come from anywhere in the States. But Kentucky would like you to believe that it's not bourbon unless it comes from Kentucky.
Right. So this one's actually from a fairly new distillery called Sycamore Distilling. It's, again, in honor of Mike. It's coming right out of Cincinnati, Ohio, which is near and dear to his heart. I have not tried this one before, so I picked it up in honor of this special occasion. Now, again, to the point of what makes a bourbon a great bourbon, typically it's that barrel age, right, that really makes a bourbon great. Unfortunately, this one is aged 2+ years, as it says right on the bottle, so I'm a little bit worried, but I figured that I would at least give it a shot.
Now, I think this does break the rules a little bit because if I'm not mistaken, to be a bourbon, it has to be at least 4 years in a barrel. That's my understanding, I think.
I should have looked a little closer at the law, but yeah. I'm this may be skirting it a little bit.
That's all right.
But we're still gonna crack it open and give it a try.
Well,
I've been saving this one just for tonight.
It's just going to be one of those craft distilleries that can get away with a lot of different things. So as far as myself, most people know who I am, so I'm not going to go through that. I'm going to go straight to the important stuff, which is the bourbon. So what I chose for a variety of different reasons. The first reason was I figured that none of you would have this bourbon, so it wouldn't overlap. And so I've got the Woodinville Whiskey Company bourbon. This comes from Seattle, Washington. It's actually about a mile from where I used to live when I lived in Washington. And so they opened up about 2 years before I left Washington. And I mean, the guys are great that have started this. It's a craft distillery. It's 71% corn, so they're well within their tolerances and all that great stuff. But everything's locally sourced. So everything's coming from their local farm that they own and operate. The barrels come from Kentucky, so they get all the white oak barrels from Kentucky. So yeah, and like you said, Todd, one of the characteristics of a good bourbon, and Arun, you said this as well, is you're able just to be able to sip on it. Should be at room temperature, and you have a long day, you just sip on that for a little bit, and all your problems start to melt away. So those are the bourbons. We're going to sip on those as we talk about this. And sorry, Arun, that you're unable to join us on that journey.
So, Mike, before we jump into our journey, since you mentioned it, one of the things that for the bourbon novices that are joining us today, that I learned early on is that when you have a bourbon, you can drink a bourbon neat without ice, or you can drink a bourbon with ice. And so it's an important thing to understand that when you drink a bourbon with ice, you are actually going to change the flavor profile of the bourbon. And in fact, as the ice melts, like Mike talked about your stress melting away as you drink your glass of bourbon, the ice melting will actually change the flavor profile of your bourbon. So if you're new to this, hopefully you'll enjoy that drinking tip.
Yeah, and one thing that to folks that don't drink a lot of bourbon, I often recommend to them is actually dilute with water or ice to begin with, because bourbon's always got that initial bite that scares you off a little bit. But it starts to open up some of the flavors, and it's less alcoholic-y. It really starts to bring out the kind of those caramel oak flavors. So usually for some of the newer folks, I say, throw a little bit of water in there. It's not going to hurt anything. It's been aging for 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, however long. It's going to be okay. It can handle it. So those are great call out, Mike. I think that's pretty cool. So we're talking about emerging technologies that are going to change the face of the planet for the next 10 years. And Gartner's got the Rosetta Stone that's going to help us out with that. It's called the Emerging TechnologiesHype Cycle. I think it's important for us to kind of calibrate ourselves real quick before we jump in. I've got a little bit of history with this hype cycle. If you guys know me from my past, I actually wrote the hype cycle for 4 or 5 years. So, I kind of understand the process. Now, what people most often get wrong about the hype cycle is they think it should include every technology under the sun that will be relevant over the next 10 years. That's not accurate. So what Gartner's trying to do is they're trying to take around 2,000 technologies that they profile across the year, and they want to distill it down to, much like bourbon, want to distill it down to anywhere between 30 to 40 technologies that they think will be the most differentiating in the market over the next 10 years for competitive advantage or just overall impact in the marketplace. So as we start to talk about this, guys, think about it in that perspective. Another important perspective is think about the time horizon as well. We're looking at 5 to 10 years. So this isn't a Horizon 1, maybe a little bit of Horizon 2 type of stuff where we're kind of in that 1 to 3 years. That's really not the purpose of this particular hype cycle. They've got, believe it or not, 110 other hype cycles that focus on specific aspects or domains, etc. So as that is a calibration point, what I want to do is, as panelists, I want us just kind of open it up here on, what were some of you guys' initial impressions of the hype cycle this year for 2020? Mike, let's maybe start with you, as you work. You're at an insurance company. You lead an innovation capability. What were some of your initial impressions?
Yeah, so for me, where I was really intrigued was around some of the AI augmented ideas, or at least for our world, right? So part of what we do within our emerging technology team is we build prototypes. And so there were 2 specific technologies that were called AI augmented development and AI augmented design that I found very intriguing for our use for development of prototypes. We already build prototypes fairly quickly, but the AI augmented design is all about allowing the computer to help generate user interfaces, right, and design those user interfaces, which I find really intriguing. As developers, that's one of the hardest things for our team to do. It's a very unique, it's a very specific skill set to make a user interface look good. And so I'm really intrigued about leveraging that kind of technology where we can let our developers do their work and bring what they're experts at to the table, and allow us to leverage AI to help with some of this really scarce resourcing that we have with the user experience folks. So that was one piece. The other piece was around AI augmented development. So how do we actually help organizations build out systems more quickly? And so again, within the prototype world, we don't need that nearly as much. But then when we go from prototype to production, how do we write the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of lines of code to bring that production system to life? And so leveraging artificial intelligence, again, to do some of the heavy lifting and allowing the people to really bring that expert knowledge and resource to make sure that it's done properly and to handle some of the more advanced components of the code, I thought was a really intriguing approach. And I think we're going to, as an emerging technologies team, we're going to explore whether we can put that into our toolbox to help us build prototypes faster. Nice.
Arun, anything pop out for you about this year's Hype Cycle? Things that you thought, wow, this is amazing that this is here, didn't realize this, or maybe things that you're like scratching your head on? What was your overall impressions?
So I think a couple of things. Going back to the construct of the Hype Cycle and the overall view, and I'm digressing, but bear with me. I'd love your feedback. I believe, and I am seeing or experiencing that with the pandemic, the pace of thinking and getting things done is unprecedented. So organizations aren't waiting for the Hype Cycle, with all due respect, right? Yeah. It's a good one to look at. But if you look at the e-commerce numbers that came out this week and last week, the last 48 to 72 hours, smashing records. Why? They were able to pivot quickly. They were brick and mortar, most of them, I'm not going to take names, but they were able to pivot, but also accelerate whatever they were doing with digital transformation, right? Digital transformation is a big bucket. And in the Hype Cycle, you have different categories of digitally native or digitally enabled business models that we can go after and do, right? And so one thing that stood out and one thing we're seeing a lot of traction for is, okay, coming out of the pandemic, if you're going to do something with a capital investment, why not do something with sustainability and environmentally conscious sort of process and decarbonize or lower our carbon drawdown? Microsoft has a significant statement. Amazon came right after it. Apple came right after that. Everybody's got these big, bold statements. Gartner was right to pick it up. There's a whole slew of things to be done. You can't just flip a switch and say, hey, let's be carbon neutral tomorrow. It's a process, right? And to me, that stood out as one of the key takeaways, because in my role, and again, coming back to my experiences, one may ask, hey, you're the blockchain guy. What are you doing with climate? Well, it's the provable emissions. It's the provable offsets. And why? Because shareholder value is automatically impacted by proving that you're all not only meeting your carbon drawdown goals, but you're managing your enterprise more effectively. And so that answering your question that way, that was the one thing that stood out. But I also look at the Hype Cycle and say, how do we help the Hype Cycle become a little more post-pandemic friendly, if that makes sense? Going back to my digital transformation comment. Does that help?
It helps a ton, and if I could give you a high five, I would, because I think you're pointing out some important characteristics here. One is the rate in which the Hype Cycle is published is every year, every calendar year. Is that too few times that it's published? I mean, shouldn't this be a living, breathing thing, because the market is continuously changing? Believe it or not, that was something that I heard frequently from clients as well. Back then it was more, can you release this thing quarterly? But it may need to be even faster turnaround, maybe monthly, given the state of play and where we're at. I also agree with you. Another key thing that you pointed out, Arun, was around post-pandemic world. It looks very different than pre-pandemic world. The priorities have shifted. My real big disappointment with this year's Hype Cycle was it didn't capture these huge market shifts. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're in the middle of an economic crisis, equivalent to the Great Depression. We've got social injustice. We've got trade wars. we've got lots going on. And it felt to me that the hype cycle should address a lot of these characteristics more directly, and talk about, hey, we're going to be in a touchless world. No one wants to touch anything. So what does that mean from technology? So what that means, and I'll tell you from being an author of a hype cycle, it means taking some of the stuff we removed from the hype cycle and now putting it back on. Because now augmented reality and virtual reality, or the fancier term now is extended reality, becomes much more important now for interaction over web conferences, getting a burger. Robotics are now much more important to make sure we get those in the local McDonald's, all that great stuff. Maybe even autonomous things, maybe autonomous vehicles. Maybe that timeline gets pushed forward more. Because another key aspect that you talked about, Arun, was the non-technical drivers. With all these trends that I tried to incorporate in the hype cycle, is essentially triggers, environmental triggers that are going to force things to move faster or move them slower. So a great example with augmented reality, one year we said, oh, this is 10 years away. And then the Pokemon Go app came out. Then Apple said every phone will have an AR chipset.
Right.
That's all it took. That's all it took. Right. So I think respecting and understanding that there are these non-technology drivers that will impact their predictions, and maybe even putting some probability statements on there, quantifying this a little bit more, I think would be better as well. And then lastly, you mentioned sustainability. I think that was a huge miss. And those are two big things that I think that are glaring holes around the sustainability tech and the sister set of technologies around energy tech. Where's the battery technologies, right?
Oh, yeah.
Over the air electricity, all these things that are going to start popping here over the next few years. Anywho, I could ramble on all day long about that, but I think those are great points.
So Mike, I think one of the things I wanted to interject there, right, is I think you make a really good point. I think the hype cycle missed the boat in that it didn't really emphasize the pandemic and the changes in the timelines for different kinds of emerging technologies as a result of the pandemic. Some technologies are moving much, much faster. Some technologies are moving much, much slower. Now, to the point you made earlier, is that the job of this specific hype cycle, or is that the job of one of the other 110 hype cycles that you were talking about? Good question. I don't know the answer to that. But I do think there was absolutely an opportunity to bring that into this a little bit more. This particular hype cycle talked about that with social distancing technology and with health passport. But I think those are far too basic, and there wasn't really any nuance there. I was really disappointed in that piece. The other thing I would say, and again, to counter what your recommendation was, I think it would do us a real disservice to do this hype cycle quarterly. Now, other hype cycles, sure, maybe, but we're looking at Horizon 3 when we talk about the emerging technology hype cycle, right? As a general rule, we should be looking at technologies that are not going to be changing quarterly, right? Because we're looking so far out and things are just not going to move that quickly, that fast. And so I
counter your counter, Mike, and I'm going to say, you want to know really quickly if that 10-year prediction, if it just isn't going to work and people are divesting next quarter, you want to make sure that you and your company, that you're not going to continue to invest in something that may be dead on arrival. So I agree, but I think they should constantly revisit, instead of focusing on market awareness and hype, focus on the true life cycle of these emerging technologies. So I agree with definitely don't go and rethink all this, but also I think making sure that we have a pulse on this, because as Arun pointed out, all it takes is one or two events. A politician to say this is legal or illegal. The pandemic has broken all of our damn supply chains. And And I'm sure Mike, in the insurance world, priorities have shifted. You've prioritized things and deprioritized other things. So all I'm saying is, I think it needs more love and more a constant kind of reevaluating the stage in which it's at. That's it.
And I would say that for a customer company like Nationwide, like my company is, we're typically this is more of a pay attention to what's coming. Let's start to think about things sort of a time horizon versus we need to change what we're actively doing. I would actually argue, and maybe Todd's got a great perspective on this, in his world, he cares about changes on this kind of a hype cycle on a quarterly basis because he's making real major dollar investments on this stuff. So maybe Todd, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, and let me answer from the other direction because I think it's an intriguing line of questioning. And I wonder if the hype cycle is actually changing a little bit, or the nature of it is changing. Looking back 5 years ago, the world was just more decentralized. Yesterday, Apple became a $2 trillion company. I think 25% of the stock exchange value is in 5 different companies. So it's hyper centralized and really all about scale. So, Mike, when you mentioned Pokemon Go, and that was a singular event, Apple or Google or Facebook has the ability to move markets and really hack the hype cycle in a way that they may never have been able to do before. So I wonder if the hype cycle is broken in some way, and that with big tech so powerful, that there are going to be a more binary series of outcomes. Things are either going to happen or they're not, versus things happening at a predictable cadence.
Wow. You just blew my mind there, Todd.
All of us.
Mine too. Excellent. Excellent thoughts.
That's it. That's exactly it. And if I may, Mike, just to continue what Todd was saying, I think the broader issue is no longer waiting for investments to take place, and whether it's the FANG or the FAGMA or whatever the acronym is, they're not waiting for the business to be at the speed of thought, just taking on the Bill Gates's book. It's innovation at the speed of thought, right? And there are enterprises that will need to curate, to Mike's point earlier, right? Curate, examine, and say, okay, this is how it applies for front, middle, back office operations. But then there's these digital natives. I keep coming back to that. Like if you look at telemedicine, I mean, this massive merger just last week between 2 majors. Again, I can't mention them because we work with some of them. Massive stock swap deal because they have significant market capture in a pandemic, breaking the mold of patient care, breaking the mold of delivery of care, right? And then the engagement is as effective. So now you have, Cleveland Clinic is one of the largest care centers in Ohio. The model has shifted on them, and how are they going to keep up? So the hype cycle should be about bringing the non-digital natives, to Todd's point, into that digital equality, if I can say that, and then provide the level of dexterity to say, okay, I can move things around quicker, easier, without too much capital expenditure, and stay relevant. The big part of this is going to be coming out of pandemic. We're already seeing a number of bankruptcies. Who's coming back? The question is, who's not only going to survive, but how and why?
Yeah, that's interesting because, when we think about that particular question that you just posed, Arun, around where you don't have billions and billions of dollars in cash reserves like an Apple or a Google, Microsoft, et cetera, you might not be able to weather the storm. And so after all of this is kind of, done and over with, what does the market landscape look like? Because before it was centralized, to your point, Todd, it was becoming more and more centralized. Does this just heighten that and take it to the next level where there's going to be even more centralization than ever before?
Yeah.
Well, and go ahead, Todd.
Thank you. And to Arun's point, it's hard to think of any of this outside the construct of the pandemic, just because it defines everything now. I mean, there's the month of March just changed everything. There's pre-March, there's post-March, and they're different worlds, different universes. And I guess in our world, when we think about funding technologies that will be used in a business application, COVID has narrowed the scope of things that are being evaluated. It's put more focus on higher impact needs. The priorities have changed. And it's strange to think about short term in relation to hype cycle, right, which should be a 5 to 10 year run, and perhaps things revert to the mean over time. But I think one of the changes is people are more open to change. People know things are happening and are accepting it. And telehealth was mentioned. I talked to the head of a health system recently, and they made a comment which I suspect is true for many, that they've seen more adoption of telehealth in the past several months than the past several years. It is a real forcing function and hard to ignore.
Yeah,
I tell you what, I don't know about you guys, but I'm never going back. I have done telehealth during this pandemic. I did not before, and I found it so easy and so convenient that if I have an option to do telehealth, I am not going in to see the doctor. I will only if I am absolutely required to.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think you're right that, we're never going back, because I think one of the barriers to entry, and, I think, Arun, given, just the broad spectrum of clients that you touch from a KPMG perspective, full well that in a digital transformation, oftentimes initially there's a lot of resistance because they just haven't tried it yet. They haven't got the taste of, oh, yeah, why haven't we been doing this all along, right? But now they've been forced to. Mm-hmm. Now they're like, look, we've got to be remote. We've got to, balance our portfolio. We got to do this. We got to do that. Now, a lot of those barrier to entry questions are now off the table, and now it's about accelerating a lot of these technologies. And so I guess when I look at the hype cycle, I wonder to myself, like, I agree with you, Mike. I was like, I looked at the health passport stuff, and I'm like, okay, sure. But that's now. That's not 10 years from now. That's not 5 years. That's right now. Shoot, I patented an application with GE to build it, and we're actually deploying it at airports right now. So that's not future. Right. But, thinking about maybe some of those technologies, were there technologies on that list that you're like, yeah, you've kind of got that out? Well, actually, on the hype cycle, it would be this way. You got it more towards the innovation trigger and not further out. Were there technologies that you're like, this pandemic is going to push these technologies forward? Were there any one or two technologies that you saw that would be the case?
So go ahead. This is the awkward. Go ahead. Okay. I think
moderator job here.
Yeah. So I think the one thing that is going to pull some of this forward, I think, is quantum. Right? We're not talking about quantum. Quantum. Everybody thought it was this lab experiment, just like blockchain was a lab experiment 10 years ago. Before that, big data was a lab experiment 10 years ago. Quantum's, at the end of the day, it's cryptography. It's a cryptographic way, right, of doing processing while at the same time producing keys to manage the different transactions. It's blockchain on steroids. And if there was ever a greater need to pull up the development of quantum, it's going to be in the next 5 years. It's no longer a 10-year thing, because quantum has applications in security, and dare I say, it has applications on national security, right? And so, because it's the ultimate key breaker, right? So how do you then make sure that you're prepared, of external threats? There are several, and I'm bringing a different angle to this because I work with government, and there is a heightened sense of saying, what do we not just see from our internal view, but the inbound, right? And one example I give you, and again, I'm going to put on my blockchain hat, bear with me for a minute. The Chinese national blockchain system is live, okay? Whether we like it or not, every 5 kilometers, there's a 5G node and there's a blockchain node, city by city, localized, all the way done, right? And it's called the BSN. You can Google it, and it's publicly available, so I'm not disclosing anything that is not known. So if there's that system that stood up at scale, how do you not only have American competitiveness, but also the ability to manage the emerging side, the investment side, and make a practical use of some of these components. And to me, quantum is that thread, that single thread that goes across consumers, enterprises, businesses, digital ecosystems, or even health, or any sector you pick. It's that sliver, and it's going to come in much more sharply inbound than we thought. I'll just leave it there.
When I looked at the hype cycle, I think they dropped quantum off the list, didn't they?
Right. It's
both quantum and blockchain are gone.
Which I was just like,
which is like, okay, my job is irrelevant now. Oh, what? No.
but you're right. I mean, so we'll actually have an upcoming episode where I'm talking to a physicist about quantum that works for Microsoft that's building this stuff. And, she's telling me, she's like, look, the world's strongest encryption I can crack in 10 minutes with quantum, which would take millions of years with classical computing. And so you're right, it's a national security threat. It's an economic threat. That means every payment can be hacked, right? Anybody that's using HTTPS, guys, you're vulnerable. But I think the real race there is the quantum computing as a service. It won't be the rogue nations that are doing evil, bad things, behind the scenes, while they'll still try to do, things. That's, James Bond world that I know nothing about. But, it's really going to be that as a service where now it's, ubiquitous. And now as a competitive differentiator, I can now use quantum to create these algorithms to reinvent the insurance industry, as an example, and really do really interesting things. And I'm not giving anything away because we've said this publicly. I mean, to have something where the error, because the problem is error rates, is keeping things in a quantum state long enough to do anything useful is tough. You can have as many qubits if you want, but if it errors out and you can't, I'm trying desperately not to use the scientific terms, just to keep it simple. But to keep it at that state where everything's stable, and that superposition, then it doesn't matter how many qubits you have. So that's really the race, is to get those error rates down so you can sustain that environment for a length of time to do that compute to crack those algorithms. Or now, what's even more important, which I was hoping was going to be on the hype cycle, was quantum proof cryptography.
Oh, yes.
Right,
exactly.
Right.
That's yeah, exactly.
Well, so as I've read through the 85-page document that is the actual document that sits behind the pretty graphic that is the hype cycle for emerging technologies this year, the thing in this context, in this conversation around quantum that jumped out at me, right, is they didn't have quantum, but they had carbon-based transistors, and they had DNA computing and storage, and then they had bidirectional brain-machine interfaces. And what I would have really appreciated and been interested in is a little bit of a conversation about how those things fit together in a continuum, right? How should I think about this as the evolution of compute or the evolution of storage, and what's going to be possible when? I think that helps to give us context of why these different technologies matter, how they intersect with and interplay with each other. And I really missed that in this hype cycle document. Now, I don't know if when you did this, Mike, if you incorporated that kind of thinking into the conversation, if it was just much, much better back then. But I'm assuming it was, of course. But that's kind of thing I think there'd be an opportunity to do. And maybe as we bring in this and put it in context for our companies, maybe that's part of our job. Arun for the companies he works with, Todd for his venture companies, and me for Nationwide.
Yeah, so you hit on something really important, and I think it's a good segue into kind of with this broader conversation across all of us, is the key emerging technology trends are supposed to answer that question for you. So the trends, you'll notice if you go all the way back, the first time it was introduced is when I introduced it in 2016. So I introduced it for that very explicit purpose, was to put more meaning behind why did we pick these 40 technologies? Of all these other technologies, why do we think that these are most important? And so 2 years ago, one of the the trend that I had defined was do-it-yourself biohacking. And my whole premise was over the next 10 years, you won't need a surgeon to biohack. We can already inject ourselves with gene therapy today. CRISPR is going to go to, the next level. You can get a tattoo with a circuit on your body. You can buy wearables that interact with a device, a pacemaker. So, it's going to be, and that was the intent with the themes, or the trend, should I say, was to put more explanation and context behind those. But, I found that the trends that were defined, I was scratching my head a little bit, and maybe it was just because I needed more context. But I thought things like composite architectures, I was like, well, shit, I wrote a book about that, 15 years ago. And I was like, digital me. I'm like, okay, yeah, and give me more. So the trends were really supposed to do that. I guess for you guys, starting with Todd, what did the trends mean to you? Were you like, yes, these are great, love them, don't have any issues? Did you think there were some gaps? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I thought they were fine, but I have a little bit of an allergic reaction to technology first versus need first. In my mind, it's the use cases and the applications of technologies and what people want and need that pulls those technologies forward. So, you mentioned DIY biohacking, right? And that's an example that I can't speak to, but sounds fascinating. But as an example, there's a need for more and more vibrant and fast decision making, right, within all sorts of entities, and that means you need tools in your own hands, right? You don't need it in third-party hands. And with one of our companies in particular, Remesh, which is a New York City-based AI company, they have a solution for qualitative research. They basically allow brands to ask questions of their customers and get answers faster, better, in a qualitative way at scale. So the AI is great, but what it does is it solves that particular problem. And so from our perspective, we don't invest in the technologies, we invest in the solutions, right? So you mentioned blockchain before. We don't invest in blockchain per se, right, any more than we would have invested in Java or Python or any other language. We invest in solutions, and sometimes when these technologies intersect and they ladder up to the needs, that's when we get really excited. So I guess I tend to think more about what are the secular trends that are driving the needs of consumers and of business users, and based on that evolution, which of these technologies enables it, which of these technologies makes it happen. I think that's a little bit more of a vibrant dynamic than simply saying this technology is going to win versus another.
Yeah.
So Todd, I agree with you and I disagree with you. And I live my world in this intersection, right? So, and the reason why I agree with you is because I do fundamentally believe that solving that customer need, solving that business problem is really the end goal to deliver a business outcome that we're looking for, right? But where I disagree with you is this idea that, and you didn't really say this, I'm kind of implying this from all of my other conversations, right? That it's wrong to look at technology first. The thing that I fundamentally believe have lots and lots of examples where I have seen it happen over and over and over again is that if you are looking at technology first, at times, right, what it does for you is it opens up your aperture. It expands your mind around what's possible. And what I have seen over and over and over again, when you go to customer conversations, when you try to extract needs first, people will implicitly, without stating it, they will close their mind around what's possible, right? And so if you can have that combination of the need and then leveraging a conversation about the technology to open up the mind, that's where I think you can get some really interesting and powerful intersection points and potential solutions. And so that's what I love about the hype cycle is it opens up our minds. You talked about you've never had any experience with biohacking. I haven't either, but it's sure as heck opened up my mind as to what I could possibly do with that. And I'm starting to think about that a little bit differently. On our tech trends or our hype cycle, I had never even considered that you could do something like DNA computing and storage. Right, that's one of the technologies. I didn't know you could turn my DNA into a computer. That's freaking crazy. Right? Now, what does that mean? I have no idea, but I'm going to spend a little bit of time thinking about that, and it's going to open up my mind to some different possibilities. So
yeah. The only problem is that your DNA only holds, I think it's somewhere around a couple gigs of data. That aside, and I've got lots of comments about what both you and Todd had said, and I agree with both perspectives. I think both are critically important. Arun, I want to make sure I get to you. I know that you've got another commitment. We're going to be able to plug you back into this. We'll edit it in post. How about that? But I want to get your perspective on this real quick before you have to jump.
Sure. So, I hear Todd's perspective. I hear what Mike is saying. We go across the breadth, and I'll give you an example, not to plug Android, but about 3 generations ago, if you can see my screen.
It's very blurry.
Okay, it's the Samsung S20.
Microsoft cares about your data. We're just trying to block all that out.
It's a native blockchain key store already on the Samsung Galaxy S20. It's been there for 3 generations. Why? Because Asia is moving at a faster pace of ubiquitous computing that's in your hand. What is Alipay? It's touchless, was touchless, designed to be touchless, right? And I draw on that example because when we look at payment systems in the US, we're catching up. But to Todd, your point earlier on these massive tech owning most of equity markets, why? Because they've just put it in there, and they're going to keep putting and adding it on without calling it out, because that's how quickly they can get to making things touchless, seamless, commercially viable, without saying, I'm going to go break the bank. And next thing you know, it's in your hands, right? So there's that part of it, right? And when we come in and we try to look at it from a consultative perspective, it's strategy, ops, tech, and ops and execution, right? So when you look at all that whole life cycle of tech, it's always about, to Mike's point, what are you trying to solve, right? Where are you going? East, west, north, south, whatever it is. But at the same time, the counter question is going to be, where can you take me, right? So it's that conundrum, and that's why we're in this business that we're in, where we say, okay, we'll be the GPS, like the nonpartisan. We'll come in, we do some planning, but it gets harder, or it at least 10x harder with emerging tech, because we're finding out, the organization's finding out. At the same time, the value story is not clear enough, because to your point, Todd, again, it's tech for tech. So what, right? What does it do? Tech is an enabler at the end of the day, right? But as tech becomes ingrained into the digital native businesses, I keep coming back to that, payment systems or not, if you look at, again, this is publicly available information, 3 years ago, Square, Jack Dorsey came out and said, Square is going to be the first crypto native payment infrastructure. Last quarter, lo and behold, they processed $850 million declared revenue in 1 quarter alone of crypto payments. People are paying with their phones and using Square as the mechanism. So it's transaction fee, new opportunity. How do you do that? What do you do with it? And so those are kind of things we get involved in. But at the same time, how do you plan the trajectory of capital investment, to your point, Todd, while keeping a path on saying, where's my ROI, right? And those are questions a lot of people struggle with. There aren't real, there's no silver bullet, but there's always good bourbon.